Hello. Wow, neat. Okay.
Yeah, so basically, as you can hear that Mr. Daniel Robbins, and I don't have to introduce. Who don't know who is he? So basically, he's a founder of Gentoo and Funtoo, and he will tell us about his journey with open source and the lessons learned, and even it's quite late and we are here from 10 a.m., we'll watch and listen carefully. So,
thank you very much. I'm really honored to be invited here. Thank you for inviting me here and allowing me to speak. I actually don't give many presentations. I tend to be holed up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. You guys probably don't know much about Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's actually one of the poorest states in the United States. It's sort of close to Mexico. It's high desert. We have a lot of people coming from Mexico into Albuquerque. We have a lot of poor, actually, which you may not know, in Albuquerque. It's really not at the hub of technology at all. It's just sort of the middle of nowhere in the United States. It's probably about as the middle of nowhere as you can get in the United States, and still be in the United States. Albuquerque is actually, though, a city of about 500,000 people in the middle of this huge desert. We have a military base, we have national labs, and you probably know, probably New Mexico is most famous for housing the Manhattan Project, where the atomic bomb was created up in Los Alamos. So today, I'll talk about Gentoo. How many people here have heard of Gentoo? A lot of people have heard of Gentoo. Any Gentoo users here? Okay, great. Probably, I'm not even going to ask if there are any Funtoo users. It'll be embarrassing. So I would say, Gentoo started as a pet project of mine in Albuquerque when I was quite young, like early 20s. It became extremely popular. It was the top of distro watch for a long time. I mean, there was a lot of energy around Gentoo. And then it got to the point where I got so big that it sort of almost destroyed my life. Because it just had there were so many demands on me personally. And I was just a young kid. And then I resigned from the project, and I took a job at Microsoft, of all places. I was a little bit frustrated at the world of open source. I was totally burnt out, and I just wanted to write some software. I thought, wow, just let me write some software, because this open source thing, it got very political and strange. And I was burnt out, and I just wanted to write software and be left alone. Turns out that Microsoft has its own problems. I was probably there about a decade too early for open source. They did have an open source lab. It turns out it was kind of a show that they had there for analysts, and they weren't really doing a ton of stuff. And I replaced a guy who was there for a short time before me, who also got frustrated, and after 8 months I was very frustrated, and I went back to Albuquerque. Shortly after I went back to Albuquerque, people realized, oh, Daniel Robbins exists. Maybe we should offer him a job. I guess, he's just out there in the middle of the desert. So it served its purpose, I guess, for that. But, after I resigned from Gentoo, in some ways, I know there are many people in here who know of Gentoo and love Gentoo, but in many ways it sort of turned into a forgotten distribution. This working? Okay, here, I'll look at next. I did it. Okay. So, we didn't have the greatest logo. I went to work at Microsoft. I was in the middle of a desert, trying to create this distribution, half the time in my underwear. I wasn't doing any kind of networking with people, like going to conferences or talking. I was really isolated. In some ways, I did almost everything I could to sort of, not intentionally, but I wasn't really doing the proper steps to make Gentoo a success. You know, at least looking back, I can see a lot of mistakes. Like, the ideal place to be would be Bay Area, Silicon Valley, right? Talking to all the hot startups. Well, I definitely wasn't. In fact, a lot of the developers in Gentoo were much better connected to the tech world than I was. So, you know, 2003, 2004, in some ways, Gentoo went through a period after me. It sort of fell off the face of the earth, except for its fans. And I remember shortly after I resigned from Gentoo, I was still running the Gentoo store and selling Gentoo t-shirts for a little bit. And I got a call from a guy by the name of Mark Shuttleworth, who you might know as the guy behind Ubuntu. And he told me, well, he asked me, he said, you know, I'm going to start this new Linux distribution. And since you just resigned from Gentoo, and that seems to be going away, could you just tell all the Gentoo developers to start working on my new distribution, Ubuntu, instead? That would be really great, because you have like, you know, 200 to 300 developers, and they could just start working on mine. And I thought, no, because Gentoo's still my baby. I still love Gentoo, and I wouldn't want to do that and betray my distribution in that way. And I'll get back to this later, but Funtoo is sort of my way of reconnecting with my first love of Gentoo and getting it working for me in a way that's compatible with my life. So, you know, we have something that has sort of been, in some ways, left behind, you could say. You know, if you go into the corporate world, a lot of it is Red Hat and OpenSUSE. Binary distributions really are the most prominent kind of distribution out there. You know, Gentoo does a rolling release, which is inherently unstable. We have a stupid cow as our mascot. So, you know, isn't Gentoo the forgotten distribution at this point? And actually it isn't. There's a lot of stuff going on with Gentoo. It's sort of had a renaissance. We have Gentoo being used by Google as the foundation of ChromeOS for Chromebooks. It's used for their on-hub device. ChromeOS is using it for container Linux as the foundation for container Linux, which is one of the premier container solutions out there. And not only that, but Sony is using it for PlayStation Now. And Sony bought a company called Gaikai, which uses Gentoo exclusively on all their servers. Pretty much 95% of all their equipment there is running Gentoo exclusively. And what they do is they allow people to play PlayStation 3 games remotely. So if you have a PlayStation 4, you can connect to PlayStation Now, and it will send your controller commands to their data center where they're running PlayStation 3s, enter your commands into the console, and stream back video and audio of what happened in real time. So they host the PlayStation 3 hardware. So there's a lot of stuff going on with Gentoo. It's really great. I think there's a reason why. There's a reason why Google chose to use Gentoo. There's a reason why Sony chose to use it. There's a reason why ChromeOS chose to use it. There's a reason. There are a select few of us in the world who really understand the beauty of Gentoo. And really that is that Gentoo is really not only ideal for a desktop and learning Linux and exploring and playing and getting you engaged with Linux, but it's also really ideal for building up appliances. And that's what we found. Google, in using it for ChromeOS and for their devices. And it's starting to be discovered as a server operating system, and that's what Sony is using it for. So it's just really incredible to me that these companies are picking it up. They're getting a lot of value out of it. They're choosing it above other Linux distributions, and I think that's fantastic. And of course, I think Gentoo is the best distribution to choose for learning about Linux, just because it puts you in touch with what's going on your system without forcing you to do tons of annoying manual steps like Linux from scratch. But Linux from scratch is a great project. So I wanted to give you sort of some details about me and personal info about me and sort of my history and how that funneled into Gentoo. So I was born in Montreal, Canada. In second grade, my mom signed me up for a computer programming class, I think with the intention of having me around to fix computer stuff, because she thought, this computer thing's probably going to take off and I have no clue how they work, so yeah, my son will fix it for me. Unfortunately, it was a good combination, and at that time, the Apple IIe was a huge thing. So I had an Apple IIe, and is that my water? I guess I can just grab a new one. And I was programming Logo, and it was great. Then when I was around 8, my parents got divorced, and I ended up going with my mom to the Boston area, which was actually going through its own renaissance of computing. In the 70s, it was really the headquarters of a lot of technological growth in New England. And my mom was working at Harvard Medical School, so I got to see SGI workstations and other cool stuff. And continue to really turn into an Apple IIe geek. And as a kid, we got a Mac Plus, and it was really cool. And then I discovered the Amiga sort of late in the Amiga's life, and was really inspired by that technology. So, went through elementary school. We didn't really have great computer classes. Then I got to a really great high school. So high school for us is 14 through 18. Freshman year, Fortran. Sophomore year, Pascal. Junior year, AP Computer Science. And I really felt like after I got a data structures class, I really had everything I needed for the foundation of knowledge. I feel like I could learn everything else on my own. Maybe I was a little too zealous, but that's what I thought. I taught myself C, and we had a cool group of guys that were super geeky too. Like one of my friends, Kirill, in high school, one of the kind of the coolest moments of like geek bragging is he would break into the MIT computer lab. He didn't go to MIT, but he got the passcode to the door to enter the computer lab, and then he would get me root on their Unix workstations because there was a security hole in Kerberos. So he's just like, here, okay, let me set you up. And he would sort of walk over here. We'd all sort of try to look like we're in college. I don't know how you do that. And you go like this, and you're like, okay, you have root. Okay, just hang out over there, and I'll be over here. So that was really cool. And then I actually, I went to Worcester Polytechnic Institute. I'm going to sit down for a bit. For like the better part of a year, except I found that it kind of sucked. And probably the main reason it was just the male to female ratio was just really, really bad. And it was in this town in the middle of nowhere, so it's like you were stuck on campus and there was nothing to do, and the food was bad. Fortunately, it doesn't seem like you have those problems here, which is good. And I dropped out. of Worcester Polytechnic Institute because they were just running me through this curriculum, and I was just this impatient kid. I just wanted to do something. I didn't want to go learn Scheme. Why am I learning Scheme? And I learned so much in high school that I was kind of spoiled. Like, I really wanted to get to the meatier classes, and I had to go through 2 years of stuff that I kind of already knew, or that wasn't really advancing my skill set, so I dropped out. And I went back to my high school after I dropped out. I was playing Frisbee. I saw some guys with some Lemmings t-shirts on. Have you guys ever heard of the Lemmings video game? Yeah, so I started playing Frisbee with them. And I mean, Boston is a place where there's a lot of cool stuff going on. And I talked to them and they say, hey, yeah, we work at this company called Psygnosis. And we make video games. And I was like, wow, I want to work for you. So I ended up starting at doing tech support at Psygnosis. That was my first job. Some of you guys may know of a guy named Jason Scott who does a lot of internet archiving stuff. We were co-workers in Cambridge in Psygnosis. I was actually working in the same building that the Free Software Foundation was in. There were, well, at least the mailroom. It was 675 Massachusetts Avenue. A lot of you guys might remember that address from the GPL. The mailroom was downstairs. It seemed like there were like 2 lesbians who worked in the mailroom, sorting through the Free Software Foundation's mail. We were on the 6th floor. And, it was pretty cool, and I wanted to get into software development, and it was really this neat opportunity. My boss was trying to develop a game, and because we were really only a distribution point in the US for British developed video games. But he finally figured out a way to get a software project put together, and I was part of that team. And we made Lemmings for OS2 Warp. Have you heard of OS2 Warp? Have you heard of OS2? Yeah, it was an IBM operating system that failed, but we thought, it could be a big operating system. They're aiming it towards regular users, so we made a version of it, and it was just really disappointing when OS2 went nowhere. So I developed this video game. Nothing happened with it. Then Sony decided to move all of their development to California. They shut down the office. I was laid off. And I was just kind of depressed. And finally, I'm like, I need to get out of this town. Boston kind of sucks. So I had a friend, Shazad, who had moved to Albuquerque. This place called Albuquerque. It sounded kind of cool. I knew it was really far away in the Southwest, and he was going to school there, and I knew he needed a roommate, so I said, Shazad, I'll pay half the rent, and I'll just come out, and I'll live there off my savings from working at Psygnosis. And he said, okay. So I flew out there, and I didn't know what Albuquerque was going to be like at all. I thought, it's going to be really green. It's going to be really warm. And it was warm, but it was just this dusty desert. There wasn't any green at all. And then, I was in the middle of this place where I really didn't have much economic opportunity, like in Boston. And my first job there was working at a Mexican restaurant. I got a job after video game development. I got this job working at Banditos. I was hired to be the chef. I had no cooking experience whatsoever. But I was hired to be the chef. But on the day I showed up for my job, all the Mexican guys sort of looked over at me and talked to the owner, and they were like, gringo. And they banned me from the kitchen, and I was the busboy. So I lasted for 3 days doing that before I just couldn't take it anymore and didn't show up for work. So then I was in the middle of Albuquerque, and I eventually got a job at the University of New Mexico doing system administration. And that's where I started playing around with Linux. I had some time. They were running Windows NT 3.51. I converted them to Windows NT 4 and got things working. And then all I had to do was sit around all day and watch things work. So I had a lot of time to play with Debian. I created a website for that department in UNM. And I didn't really like Debian. I started using Stampede, which was a distribution that was a lot smaller, and it was designed to be optimized for various systems and be really fast. And I started working with the developers at Stampede, and the leader was really friendly, but there were some real jerks on the project that I didn't like working with. And I eventually got to the point they were kind of like bullies. Like, you know, when you ever tried to do something new and you showed them, they would just sort of pick it apart until you're like, okay. But, you know, for no good reason, like because you actually created something much better or you fixed a problem. And eventually I thought, you know, it'll be much easier to just create my own version of Linux. I know how to build most of this stuff, and I'll figure out the rest. And around that time, I was writing articles for IBM developerWorks just on a fluke. I got this contract to write articles for IBM developerWorks. And a lot of the time, I wouldn't even know how to use some of the stuff I was writing about. They would say, could you write an article for us about Linux technologies? And I'd say, sure. I'll write an article about awk. I have no idea how to use awk, but I will figure that out. Oh, I didn't tell them that. So, you know, I would learn how to use awk, and then I'd write these articles for IBM developerWorks, and they actually turned out to be pretty good articles. And I think one of the reasons why is because I described how to use these technologies from a beginner's perspective. And a lot of the documentation I found online for these tools was written from the perspective of people who had been using the tool for 10 or 15 years. And that kind of documentation really isn't very useful for someone who's being exposed for the first time to awk or sed. So my articles seem to be well received, and that's how I was supporting myself. I started creating a distribution. I started calling it Enoch. You know, I had various jobs, UNM and a few other places. Then I got this stupid idea of buying this dual Celeron motherboard. There were like these Celeron 366s, processors from Intel. They weren't supposed to be run in SMP mode, but Asus came out with this motherboard where you could stick two of them in there. And it totally would not run Linux. It would crash every 5 minutes. So I was like, oh, I'm screwed. So I installed FreeBSD. And FreeBSD wouldn't crash the motherboard. So I started using FreeBSD for a while. And that's where I got exposed to FreeBSD's concept of ports, where there's a large repository of software. There's instructions on how to build the software, and the software is built from source code. And I was automating everything anyway to build Enoch. So I thought, you know, I really like this ports concept, except I hate makefiles. So, and I really like Python, and I like Bash, so I rewrote the ports concept, but using first Bash. Portage was originally 100 lines of Bash code, for those who know Portage and how huge it is right now. And it did a lot of the stuff that eBuild currently does. And then emerge got written in Python. So I probably could have gone to this slide. So, you know, I started creating Gentoo, and Gentoo, at that time, it was a time where there was a lot of optimism around Linux. Any day now, Linux was going to take over the world, right? We were all waiting for Microsoft to implode. And the excitement created, you know, a lot of interest from developers, and our development team grew very rapidly. And with Portage, with a port system, I created a way for people to add packages very easily. So they kind of got addicted to adding packages. So, first we had maybe 500 packages, then we had 1,000 packages, then 5,000, and just people just love building packages and adding them to our ports tree. And the project grew exponentially. Before we knew it, we were at 200 developers. That really became the essence of Gentoo, that we build it from source code. It's automatically built from source code. It automatically pulls in dependencies. And that's where we started developing our distinctives, which I list up here. So this is actually a slide I made for Linux World 2003 in New York City, talking about the distinctives. But basically, building from source automatically with dependencies, having use variables, which on an individual package basis can control what build time options get enabled automatically. And then, you can make it as lean, as bloated as you want. It can be optimized for your CPU, because you can control what compiler options it has. And it has a ports tree and an ideal distribution for learning stuff. So the distribution really took off. I originally wanted it to be a binary distribution. That was the original goal. Maybe not a full binary distribution, but the first code I actually wrote for Portage came from Stampede, and it was for binary packages. But we got so into building from source that we never quite got around to turning it into a binary distribution. And then, so it has its complexities. This is a pretty good example of the complexity of Gentoo. I'm trying to make Funtoo easier, because you don't have to compile a kernel for Funtoo. We include one built for you. And now I get to talk about sort of maybe the exciting drama part of my presentation. So Gentoo got so big that it sort of took over my life. I was working more than a full-time job trying to keep Gentoo running while trying to figure out how to generate income in Albuquerque, while having a new family and thinking I need to provide for my kids. And at the same time, I was putting all this energy into Gentoo because Gentoo, I thought, would be this vehicle that I could do all those things and help all my friends work and get paid. And at the time, there was really kind of not as much of an understanding that open source is compatible with making money. Like, if you're doing pure open source, you need to take a vow of poverty, was kind of the idea among many people. And at that time, Debian wasn't doing so well. Debian was kind of trailing behind. A lot of people were getting away from Debian. And we inherited quite a few former Debian guys into Gentoo, and they sort of brought their militancy with them, which made it very hard to sort of continue in that direction. I actually, in 2003 at Linux World, I demoed a live CD that you could boot, and it would boot into a video game that was accelerated on NVIDIA GPUs. It would run Unreal Tournament 2003. It was really cool. And I thought that would be a way that we could actually make money and still do open source. Me, as well as my friends, who I considered kind of my family on the project. And there was resistance to that. There was this fear that I was going to steal or somehow commercialize Gentoo. And there were a few people who really turned it into a very political thing. Actually, one guy who worked at Goldman Sachs, who was our head of IT and ran the Gentoo servers. And he ran them for 6 months. And one day I said, hey, I tried to log into one of them and I can't. What's the new root password? And he said, why do you need to know? And I said, well, because I run the project and they're my servers and I like to log in. And that turned into a months-long battle where this young kid was trying to figure out from this Goldman Sachs manager, like, how do I get back into my own servers and what do I do? And he was one of the primary guys really pressuring me to switch it to a not-for-profit very, very quickly. So eventually, just from all that stress, and I was still in my mid-20s, didn't have the support system I needed to deal with that. I set up the foundation, the not-for-profit foundation, and then I resigned from it. So I put all the people on the foundation to run it who I had promised would be on the foundation. So they were ahead of the not-for-profit foundation, but I was like, I am done. I need to be able to provide for myself. I need to be able to provide for my family. That politics was something I was not prepared to deal with. I was just sort of a friendly guy who said yes to every developer. If you wanted to do SE Linux stuff, I was like, cool, we'll start a Gentoo project for that. That's awesome. And I got pushed into a world that was a little tougher than I was ready for. And I don't think I had the confidence and skill I needed in areas that I didn't expect I needed skill for. Like, I thought the technical skill, I can hack that, but all of the political stuff, and I really all of a sudden had to be a manager of 200 to 300 people. A lot of them who were kind of trying to co-opt the project themselves and use it for their own selfish purposes. So it was a tricky time. So I resigned. I ran the store for a while, selling t-shirts and CDs. That didn't last for very long because I wasn't the best businessman, and apparently I was making a profit on the CDs, but not the t-shirts. And then broadband got very popular, so everybody started downloading Gentoo rather than buying the CDs. So then we started losing money. So very quickly I had to shut down the store. And then I just decided, the political stuff of open source had really burnt me out and sort of left a sour taste in my mouth. And I just wanted to write software. So I contacted Microsoft, of all people. And I thought, I'll just write some software. I'll sell it. It'll do some stupid little thing, but I'll sell for $5 and I'll be able to generate some income, and then I can do more open source stuff. So I contacted Microsoft and they kind of poached me. They had this like new business person program where you could contact them and get resources and say, I'm a new business. And I said, hey, I use Linux. I created a Linux distribution. I just want to get MSDN for free so I can start writing some software. I need to take a break from open source. And they put me in touch with a guy named Bill Hilf, who ran the Linux open source stuff at Microsoft. And he started telling me, well, I could give you MSDN for free, or you can come work with me here, and I meet with Bill Gates every month, and you can join me in those meetings, and we're going to do all these cool open source things at Microsoft, and you could be and he made me a lot of promises, and it sounded really good, and it was a way out of Albuquerque, where I was kind of stuck. So I took him up on his offer, went to work at Microsoft, and it was not great, just because, like I said earlier, the open source initiative that they were engaging upon was what I discovered a real show for the press, not something genuine. And I was sort of being used to present that image at Microsoft. So after about 8 months, I decided I need to quit, and I went back to Albuquerque and started to do just regular IT jobs and stuff. I wanted to get just regular experience doing stuff, doing DevOps things, doing IT. I really wanted to do IT, and then I started doing IT, and I realized how stupid it was. I mean, if you like IT. I mean, IT is great. But when you go into the world of IT, the software sometimes isn't as good as it could be. So I learned some IT and DevOps stuff and worked at E-Trade as a senior principal and pushed container technologies before containers were a thing. Now containers are a thing. If you talk to people about containers, their eyes light up. I liked containers before people knew what they were. Like, I would talk to a guy about containers, and I'd be like, containers are really cool. They're kind of like virtual machines, but they're better. Because with virtual machines, there's a lot of overhead. And with containers, you can run multiple instances of operating systems, and there's really like no overhead. They scale really well. They use memory really efficiently. And I just get like this blank stare back, like, huh? And then the same guy I'd see like 5 years later, and he'd come up to me and he'd be like, Docker's great. There's these things, they're like containers. And I'm like, you idiot, that's what I was talking about. But I guess the world chose Docker. I actually like OpenVZ, but that seems to be sort of fading away. So, you know, I got a lot of work experience, which I think was very important for me. I still missed Gentoo. I made some attempts to come back to Gentoo, and coming back as a developer is really not as good as coming back as the benevolent dictator. There are a lot of perks in being the leader of a project. You can make decisions. Like, people would discuss things on mailing lists, and I could just come in and say, I've read this, and I like this point, and I like this idea, so we're going to do this. And then the discussion would stop. Or most of it. And when you're just a developer and there's nobody to make decisions on a project because Gentoo became very committee-based, the way that decisions were made and continue in a lot of ways to be made is that there's a discussion on a mailing list. And it goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on. And the one who's most passionate about it, who decides, who has the most energy to talk, who's unwilling to stop talking, the one who wins, that's how the decision is made. So the decisions are often made by the loudmouths and the pushy people, and they aren't always the best decisions. And then what happens is a lot of decisions end up being made by people who don't discuss things because they don't have the time to have those long mailing list discussions. So they'll just sort of quietly go ahead. A lot of the higher end guys at Gentoo now will sort of, they'll do the right thing. They'll sort of quietly go in and do what they need to do. It doesn't encourage openness. So let's talk about Funtoo. I miss Gentoo. I love Gentoo. Gentoo's my baby. It wasn't fun coming back to Gentoo after I had resigned. It became sort of a bureaucratic project, and I experienced it from another angle. It didn't leave a good taste in my mouth, and yet I loved Portage. I loved the technology. I loved the community. So what I did is I created a project called Funtoo. And Funtoo is like my personal playground for Gentoo. So I created a fork, but it's more like a variant of Gentoo. It pulls in all of the changes from Gentoo every 12 hours automatically. And I can tweak whatever I want without getting permission. If I see a piece of Gentoo that I don't like or I want to change, I can just go ahead and go into the code and change it. And I can play around with various things. And that's what I wanted, really. Just the freedom to develop software without having all of that just political debate. Political and technical on mailing lists that last forever. and the ability to try new things and be creative. And that's what Funtoo is. So with Funtoo, we support, just to go into sort of its basic technical stuff, we support x86, we support ARM, and that's it, just to focus it in a bit. We have a new profile system that's pretty fancy, just to simplify things. There's a focus on simplification. For example, with Gentoo, it can be very hard to install. A lot of the time, people get stuck on building their own kernel because the instructions sort of say, here's how to install Gentoo, here's how to put it on your hard drive, and now you need to build a kernel. Well, for a lot of people, that is over their skill level at the time. They get stuck there. So with Funtoo, we actually pre-build a kernel for you, a universal kernel that will boot everything, like pretty much all other distributions do at this point, and that's installed for you. So you can build a kernel if you want, but it's optional. You can still get your system booted if you don't build a kernel. And we actually use a Debian kernel because we find that Debian does a good job maintaining their kernel. We don't want to waste our time duplicating effort there and just to maintain our own kernel for the sake of doing that. And we started using Git very early on. Gentoo had, I think, a 5-year project to investigate how to start using Git for source code management. I hope all of you are using Git or playing with it. How many of you use Git? Okay, good. So Gentoo had like a 5-year project to figure out how to start using Git that went nowhere. Because they were trying to figure out how to take the existing tree, the CVS tree that started in like 1999, and convert its entire history over to Git, which was probably a much too ambitious project. So I got that done in about 2 weeks, just by... See, one of the benefits of being a benevolent dictator is you can just say, that's a stupid idea, we should not do that, you should stop doing that right away. So on Funtoo, what I did is I just started using Git for here forward. And if you want to look at the history, you look at the historical CVS tree. It's very simple. Because using Git was too important to delay. So we started using Git for a lot of things, for development, for portage trees. We have a smaller and friendlier community that is really fun. I'm enjoying Funtoo again. And I find like it's the right balance for me. And I'm also trying to grow a key part of growing an open source project is that no matter how passionate you are about it, if you don't have the financial resources and the support for your project, no amount of passion is going to get it to where you want it to go. You need to have the infrastructure for it. You need to have the financial resources for it. And where I got with Gentoo was just based on pure passion, was burnout, basically. And I really learned about the challenges of resources for open source projects. So with Funtoo, we're doing quite well providing containers for our users. So any user who gives $15 a month to Funtoo gets a container on our infrastructure running Funtoo Linux that they can do whatever they want with. And the project, even though it's quite small now, is bringing in a little over $1,000 a month just from that. And I plan to be growing that and hopefully turning into a much bigger open source project soon. But I really wanted to get the financial aspect started. That needs attention. Let's say I was unable to raise any money, then that would be an indication to me like, okay, I really can't devote a lot of time to this, regardless of my passion, because eventually it's going to be consuming 60 hours a week and bringing in $0 of income. And that's something I can't sustain for years at a time. That's sort of my basic babbling story. And I'll open it up to questions because I don't know what you might be curious about. Or yes.
I know you're kind of fed up with the politicalness of the free software, but I want to ask you, BSD or GPL, which one of the licenses do you prefer? And in case of GPL, version 2 or version 3?
Okay, well, we use the GPL version 2. I actually did some stuff with licensing at Microsoft. The GPL version 2, I don't think is the best written license. It's more like a manifesto than an actual good legal document. But I think, like a lot of documents, we understand it better. It's better tested than the GPL 3. And I think BSD can be appropriate for some projects. I think that sometimes it sort of depends on what you want to accomplish. I'm not as dogmatic about free software as Richard Stallman. I like free software because it allowed me to learn. I appreciate it. It's more of a personal relationship. With Gentoo, I can watch it compile in front of me. I'm much more connected to my system than if I get a dead binary distribution that somebody built somewhere and I'm installing that. I've released stuff under BSD and other licenses like it. I recently did a digital audio project, and I felt like there's not enough of this stuff out there that's free. I really want to have an open community about it and around it, and I released it under the GPL version 2 and up. So does that sort of help? Okay.
If it is a problem for you that updates in Gentoo is very slow and sometimes may crash, how do you solve and eliminate this problem?
For updates being slow?
Yes.
Like for emerge being, do you mean like the versions not being up to date?
Yes.
Or the compiling?
Emerge, update, emerge, yes.
Okay, so the compiling. Like the compiler running and having to build everything for hours?
Can you repeat slowly?
Sure. So like when you emerge and it takes like 2 hours to install, that's what you're talking about?
Yes.
So Gentoo can take a long time to install things simply because you're compiling from source code. However, computers are getting a lot faster these days. A lot of us have this is a quad-core laptop. So I have 4 cores. It's not horrible. As long as I'm not building WebKit, I'm okay.
Gentoo isn't for weak hardware.
Oh, so I've also found that you can take a little Raspberry Pi with 1 gig of RAM, and if you add 2 gigs of swap to it, or even 1 gig, you can compile pretty much anything. And yes, it's slow, but you just start it before you go to bed, and when you wake up in the morning, but maybe I think I'm avoiding your question in a sense. So at Sony, quite a few Gentoo developers are working at Sony now for PlayStation Now. and they're using binary packages. So they have a very good system for binary packages. That system isn't really being used by Gentoo users, but it could be. And I hope to be offering something like that soon, so that you can install things quickly from binary packages if you want.
And what do you think about usage of Gentoo in commercial projects like ChromeOS or Sabayon being used for, cache machines? What's your opinion? Do you like that Gentoo is commercialized and promoted in that way, or do you find it like bringing the open source to the dark side?
I actually really like it. Sometimes I wish that the people who commercialize it would reach out to me and involve me in some way, but I also think that's kind of my fault for being cooped up in Albuquerque. I mean, for example, Google uses Gentoo in a lot of places, and so you'd think that Google would be have a friendly relationship with me. One of the developers sent me an early Chromebook, and last year they sent me a blanket and a $50 gift card. So, I don't know, your Google, can do a little better than that? I don't know.
It is a nice blanket.
Yeah, it's a nice blanket. Sure. Oh, in one moment.
I'm actually very interested about the things you said about managing people at your open source project, because you came back to open source as a benevolent dictator once again, and you said that the team is smaller, so I assume that there's less problems because of that. But do you have can you say something about what you have learned that you use now in your open source project about managing people when you're the creator, the decision-making guy? Are there any advice that you can give?
Yeah, tons. Well, Funtoo is actually a lot smaller than Gentoo. In fact, I set up Funtoo so I could run it in my spare. I could have a full-time job and it would still continue getting updates and everything. And one of the main ways I did that was through my friend Oleg in Ukraine. And I'm actually going to go visit him and meet him for the first time after this conference. And he would run the project and keep it going. And basically I would set up a system that he would keep going, and he would do day-to-day maintenance on when I was busy at work, doing various DevOps and developer things. So for a long time, we had only 2 developers, and not even 2 because I was part-time, compared to 200 plus. The things I've learned about management are when you're in a management position, it really, for me, exposed a lot of my limitations personally, and it put me in a position where I had to be aware of them. I couldn't just focus on code. I had to be aware of my own fears and anxieties, and I had to learn how to not get pulled into things and to distance myself. I think most recently what I've learned is you need to be able to make sure everyone is heard, but then you need to make a decision. And there's a process for doing that works, and there's a process for doing that. There are many processes for doing that doesn't work. But it's good to just let people know ahead of time, I need to make a decision on this. I'm gathering input. Let me know what your thoughts are. And then after you review them and people have had a voice, you can come back and say, okay, I've heard all these things, and based on this input, this is the decision I've made. And just encouraging people to understand that there's some finality about it. I think with Gentoo, I really had no management experience, and I was I was put in a position where I had to manage, and I was scared away by people who had, like a tough New York manager from Goldman Sachs could just totally take advantage of me because he had those skills and I didn't. So all of a sudden I was a little fish in a big pond, and it was difficult. Yeah. But yeah, there's tons of stuff. I think management will really, as a manager, and a lot of times in open source, you may start focusing purely on technical stuff, and then all of a sudden you discover that you're in a position of authority now, and those people skills come to a forefront, and those have not been a focus, and that creates challenging situations. Well, opportunities for growth, I guess, is the right way to say.
Actually, sometimes when I talk with my friend, he asks me about some creative ideas for some project he could develop, and I come up with these ideas, but he complains that they are not really original, and this is all about reinventing the wheel. But I'm pretty sure that they could be educational as well, and I would like to ask someone like you, probably someone much more than a senior developer, about whether it is beneficial to develop the projects that will probably die soon in terms of popularity. I mean, they might be good to be seen in your resume or wherever else, but you wouldn't definitely be able to sell them because some other big company like Microsoft would have already created them. I mean, is it just beneficial to create projects that are out in the market but could let you teach you something?
I think that's a good question. So I really like reinventing the wheel. I think whenever you reinvent a wheel, you're not really just creating something that was already created. You add your own little innovation or vision into it. So for example, right now I'm working on some power management code for my laptop because I set up my laptop and I found out it had 2 hours of battery life. And that really sucked. It's supposed to have like 8 hours of battery life. And then I looked at what I needed to do to get good battery life. So I had to install Thermal D, and I had to install ThinkFan. So 2 separate programs to help my battery life. And ThinkFan was pretty straightforward to install, but Thermal D is just, it has a stupid configuration file in XML, and I hate XML. So, I looked at what it was doing, and all it was doing is writing to files in sysfs. And I can do that easily. So why do I need to use Thermal D? I'll write my own little program to do that. So I started my own little project called Thermite, which is hopefully going to turn into a really good alternative for power management. I'm running it on my laptop now. We'll see if it didn't die. It's still running. But I love reinventing the wheel. It's great for learning. And it's going to give you confidence to do bigger things in the future. And you're also going to add your own innovation. Whenever you rebuild something, you're going to add your own little touch to it. So, yeah. And I don't think you should look for commercial success. I really seek out opportunities to learn and opportunities to help other people learn and create a fun and collaborative environment. So, yeah, I was I wanted to create something big with Gentoo, and I was motivated by sort of the views of the time that Linux was about to overtake Microsoft. It didn't happen exactly the way we thought it would. It took a little bit longer, and now it's seeping in everywhere. But we thought it was going to happen, in 5 to 10 weeks. So there was some urgency there.
So maybe this is the question, Simon. First, what do you love the most about working on open source software? And in the university, what do you hate the most about working on open source software?
Okay. So, what I love the most about working on open source software is the creative aspect of it. As a kid, I really liked Legos. I had a ton of Legos. And open source is kind of like Legos, virtual Legos. You can design things. I like refactoring code, playing with code, different ideas. I like developing a vision and then seeing my vision being realized. That's really cool. And it doesn't have to be on the level of Gentoo at all, like my little thermite program. I got it working. Wow, that's cool. The worst part of open source to me are all of the human issues that come out, which are often the personality issues, fighting, and that's not fun. And then also, open source often does have a resource problem. There's a lot of people doing good work, and they don't get the resources they need. In fact, a friend of mine works, I should have had more information on this, but is tracking down the people who write the software at the core of the internet. And it's surprising how few people maintain such critical code that we all rely on every day. And many of them don't have the resources to really stay on top of bugs, to stay on top of security issues, and to really do what they need to do to make sure that the future of the internet is secure. So that resource problem is something that when it hits you, when you feel like, I'm not getting the support I need, that can be hard.
I think we have still time for 2 or 3 questions more.
I have a question. Is a compilation from sources helps gain more performance and in which percent?
And what percent?
Yeah.
300%. No. So I'm not exactly sure. I mean, Phoronix has done some testing in the past. I don't do a lot of testing, but they found, and others have found, that it can be significant in a lot of areas. Even with 64-bit CPUs, there's new instructions that are added all the time, and new versions of GCC will support those instruction sets. Intel's Skylake processor, I think, requires GCC 6 to fully realize some of the optimizations it has. But definitely, it can be quite significant. That's what I've seen. Could be 100%.
I wanted to ask if commercial users of Gentoo are contributing back to the project.
A lot. Since I'm not officially involved in Gentoo, I can't speak for Gentoo. What seems to happen a lot of times is that a significant user of Gentoo will start hiring Gentoo developers. This is also really common with Red Hat. So Red Hat, if you're a prominent open source developer, they will offer you a job, And as long as you keep that piece working well in Red Hat, you can sort of develop open source for free. And that brings me to another point, which I forgot to mention. So, how many of you are familiar with systemd? Or have heard of it? Okay, so Funtoo intentionally does not support systemd. And one of the reasons that we really want to see the continued evolution of the Gentoo init scripts, which are called OpenRC. And systemd comes from a developer who I believe is employed by Red Hat. It doesn't mean Red Hat sanctions or is actively an advocate for systemd, but because he is helping out Red Hat, he has this opportunity to develop systemd and keep it going. So, did that answer it?
So, the last questions?
You mentioned at the start that the first idea of Gentoo was to use binary packages. But at the end, it did not occur. So we had the solution, or had the solution at ChromeOS, so folks from Gentoo that use for base packages, most common packages, binary packages. So we could just install binary packages. If you have or need a different configuration, then you need to compile everything. And why something like that was not introduced in the Gentoo in the past?
Okay, well, so just to clarify, I might have misspoke. The first portage code that came into Gentoo world that I brought over was binary package code. The reason it was written is because Stampede Linux, which was the project I worked on before, had a really stupid binary package management system. They would define a C structure that had all of their package metadata, and they would stick it on the end of a tarball. And then every new version of Stampede, they would update their C structure to have new fields that the old version didn't have. And they tack that on the end of their tarball as metadata. And it was incompatible, so the package manager couldn't read the old packages. So I wrote this new format that could be used across different versions. And that was the thing they picked apart. The developers said, oh, that's stupid. Why would we need that? It's only like totally essential for a Linux distribution. We don't need that. So that's what I brought over. So originally, that was the stuff that was brought over. Since then, I've heard that we have really good binary package support because of the work Sony has done. But I don't think that anybody has really fully utilized that. It's supposedly on par with RPM. So that's something I want to talk to the guys at Sony about looking into.
And the last question for tonight.
Just a silly question, really. What's the best C flag and why is it hyphen fun roll loops?
What is the what?
What is the best C flag in the GCC and why is it hyphen fun roll loops?
Wow. With
the toughest one.
Yeah. I mean, with Funtoo, what I did is you actually generally don't set your own C flags. You pick your subarch in a profile, and we set reasonable C flags. Not like -09 and all this crazy stuff. So.
I think we are at the time. So thank you for traveling so long to us, and we had opportunity to listen to the great life story. And welcome back for most of you tomorrow. And the two guys sitting here will also give a lecture tomorrow, Mr. Timbalby and Mr. Wadler. So welcome back tomorrow and good night.